The discovery. The old Victorian house on the edge of town had been in the family for generations. It was a sprawling, creaky structure with more rooms than anyone could reasonably use, and an attic that was filled with the detritus of decades past. When the Thompson family moved in, they had no idea what awaited them in the shadowy corners of that attic. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when Sarah Thompson decided to finally tackle the attic. Her husband, Mark, was at work, and their two children, Emily and Jake, were busy with their own activities. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, Sarah climbed the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew tickled her nose. As she began to sort through the old boxes and furniture, something caught her eye. It was a large, ornate mirror, its frame intricately carved with strange, twisting patterns that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. The glass was cloudy, but as she wiped away the dust, she could see her reflection staring back at her. There was something off about the reflection, though. It wasn't quite her. The eyes were darker, the smile a little too wide. She shook her head, chalking it up to the poor lighting and her overactive imagination. But as she turned to leave, she thought she saw the reflection move on its own. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She tried to distract herself with household chores, but the image of the mirror kept creeping back into her mind. When Mark came home, she mentioned it to him, but he just laughed it off. "It's just an old mirror, Sarah," he said, giving her a reassuring hug. "Probably worth a fortune, though. We should get it appraised." But Sarah wasn't so sure. There was something about the mirror that made her skin crawl, something that made her want to cover it up and forget it existed. The next morning, Emily was the first to encounter the mirror. She had been playing hide and seek with Jake when she stumbled upon it in the attic. At first, she was fascinated by the intricate carvings on the frame, but as she looked into the glass, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection, she saw herself, but she was older, much older. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, and she was standing in a dark, empty room, alone. She screamed and ran downstairs, tears streaming down her face. Sarah and Mark rushed to her side, trying to calm her down. When Emily finally managed to explain what she had seen, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She knew then that the mirror was more than just an old piece of furniture. That evening, Mark decided to investigate the mirror himself. He was a practical man, not prone to superstition, but even he had to admit that there was something strange about it. As he stood in front of the mirror, he saw his reflection, but it wasn't him. It was a version of himself that was angry, violent, and out of control. He saw himself lashing out at his family, hurting the people he loved most. He stepped back, shaken. "We need to get rid of this thing," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not safe." But as they tried to move the mirror, they found that it was impossibly heavy, as if it were rooted to the spot. No matter how hard they pushed or pulled, it wouldn't budge. And as they struggled, they began to feel a strange, oppressive force emanating from the mirror, a force that seemed to feed on their fear. That night, none of them could sleep. They all felt the presence of the mirror, even from the attic, as if it were watching them, waiting for them to succumb to their darkest fears. The descent. The days that followed were a blur of unease and tension. The mirror, though still in the attic, seemed to cast a shadow over the entire house. The Thompsons tried to go about their lives as usual, but the oppressive presence of the mirror was always there, lurking in the back of their minds. Sarah found herself avoiding the attic altogether. She couldn't shake the memory of the reflection she had seen, the version of herself that wasn't quite right. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew better. The mirror was alive in some way, and it was feeding on their fear. Mark, on the other hand, was determined to find a way to get rid of the mirror. He spent hours researching online, looking for any information he could find about cursed objects or haunted mirrors. He even reached out to a local historian, hoping to learn more about the house's past. What he discovered was unsettling. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy businessman named Elias Grayson. Grayson had been a recluse, rarely seen in town, and rumors had swirled about strange happenings at the house. Some said he had dabbled in the occult, while others claimed he had gone mad. Whatever the truth, Grayson had died under mysterious circumstances, and the house had passed through several owners before ending up in the Thompson family. Mark couldn't find any specific information about the mirror, but he did come across a few references to an artifact that Grayson had been obsessed with. According to the historian, Grayson had believed the artifact had the power to reveal a person's deepest fears and desires. Mark couldn't help but wonder if the mirror was that artifact. Meanwhile, Emily and Jake were struggling in their own ways. Emily had become withdrawn and anxious, jumping at every little noise. She refused to go near the attic, and even the mention of the mirror was enough to send her into a panic. Jake, on the other hand, seemed almost fascinated by the mirror. He would sneak up to the attic when no one was looking, staring into the glass as if trying to decipher its secrets. One afternoon, Sarah caught Jake in the attic, standing in front of the mirror. She called out to him, but he didn't respond. When she approached him, she saw that his eyes were glazed over, as if he were in a trance. She grabbed his arm and shook him, snapping him out of it. "Jake, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. I don't know," he replied, looking confused. "I just felt like I had to come up here." Sarah's heart sank. The mirror was affecting her children, and she didn't know how to protect them. She decided then and there that they needed to take drastic action. That night, she and Mark sat down to discuss their options. They considered calling a priest or a paranormal investigator, but they weren't sure if anyone would believe them. In the end, they decided to try to destroy the mirror themselves. The next morning, they gathered in the attic, armed with hammers and crowbars. The mirror stood there, its surface glinting ominously in the dim light. As they approached it, they felt a wave of fear wash over them, but they pushed through it, determined to end the nightmare. Mark swung the hammer at the mirror, but it bounced off as if the glass were made of steel. Sarah tried next, but the same thing happened. No matter how hard they hit it, the mirror remained intact. Frustrated and desperate, they decided to try to remove the mirror from the house. They tied ropes around it and tried to drag it down the stairs, but it was as if the mirror had become part of the house itself. It wouldn't budge. As they struggled, the air around them grew colder, and they began to hear whispers, faint and indistinct, but growing louder. The whispers seemed to be coming from the mirror itself, and they filled the Thompsons with a sense of dread. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. They retreated from the attic, but the whispers followed them, echoing in their minds. That night, they all had nightmares, visions of their worst fears brought to life. Sarah dreamed of losing her family, Mark of becoming a monster, Emily of being alone in the dark, and Jake of being consumed by something he couldn't understand. The next morning, they were all exhausted and on edge. They knew they couldn't go on like this. The mirror was slowly destroying them, and they had to find a way to stop it. Mark suggested they try to find out more about Elias Grayson and the mirror's origins. Maybe there was a way to break its hold over them. Grayson was said to have used it to control people, to bend them to his will. Mark's jaw tightened. "Do you think that mirror is still around?" Mrs. Hargrove hesitated. "It's possible. Grayson's house passed through several owners after his death, and strange things always seemed to happen there. People would move in, only to move out again a few months later, claiming the house was haunted." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think the mirror is alive?" Mrs. Hargrove's expression grew grave. "I don't know, but if it is, you need to be very careful. Objects like that, they have a way of getting inside your head." The Thompsons left the Historical Society with more questions than answers, but they were determined to find out the truth. They spent the next few days poring over old records and documents, trying to piece together the history of the mirror. What they discovered was both fascinating and horrifying. The mirror, it seemed, had a long and dark history. It had been created by a mysterious craftsman in the 17th century, a man who was said to have made a pact with a demon. The mirror was imbued with the demon's power, and it had been used by various individuals over the centuries to manipulate and control others. Elias Grayson had been the last known owner of the mirror, and he had used it to amass his fortune. But the mirror had eventually turned on him, driving him to madness and ultimately leading to his death. The Thompsons realized that the mirror was not just a cursed object. It was a living entity, feeding on the fears and insecurities of those who looked into it. And now it had set its sights on them. As they delved deeper into the mirror's history, they began to notice changes in themselves. Sarah found herself becoming more paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder and jumping at every sound. Mark's temper grew shorter, and he found himself lashing out at his family over the smallest things. Emily and Jake, too, were affected, their behavior becoming increasingly erratic. One night, Sarah woke up to find Mark standing in front of the mirror in their bedroom. She had moved it there in a desperate attempt to keep an eye on it, but now she regretted that decision. Mark was staring into the glass, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. She reached out to touch his arm, but he jerked away, his eyes still fixed on the mirror. "Mark, please," she begged. "Come back to bed." Finally, he turned to look at her, but his eyes were empty, as if he were no longer himself. "It's too late," he said, his voice hollow. "It's already inside me." Sarah felt a surge of panic. She grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him away from the mirror, but he resisted, his strength surprising her. They struggled for a moment before Mark finally relented, collapsing onto the bed. "We have to destroy it," Sarah said, her voice firm, "before it destroys us." Mark nodded, but his eyes were still distant. "I don't know if we can," he said. "It's too powerful." Sarah refused to give up. She knew they had to try no matter the cost. The next morning, they gathered in the attic once more, determined to find a way to break the mirror's hold over them. They tried everything they could think of, pouring salt around the mirror, reciting prayers, even attempting to shatter it with a sledgehammer. But nothing worked. The mirror remained intact, its surface unblemished. As they stood there, defeated, they heard a voice, a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from the mirror itself. "You cannot destroy me," it said. "I am a part of you now. Your fears are my strength, and I will never let you go." The Thompsons felt a wave of despair wash over them. They were trapped, and they didn't know how to escape. But Sarah refused to give up. She knew there had to be a way to break the mirror's power, even if it meant making the ultimate sacrifice. The breaking point. The voice from the mirror lingered in the air, its words echoing in the Thompsons' minds long after it had fallen silent. The family stood frozen in the attic, the weight of their despair pressing down on them like a physical force. Sarah, however, was not ready to surrender. She clenched her fists, her mind racing for a solution. "There has to be a way," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "We can't let it win." Mark looked at her, his eyes hollow. "What if it's right? What if we can't destroy it?" "We have to try," Sarah insisted. "For the kids. For us." Emily and Jake stood nearby, their faces pale and drawn. Emily clutched her brother's hand, her knuckles white. "What if it hurts us?" she whispered. Sarah knelt down and took her daughter's hands. "It won't," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "We're stronger than it thinks we are." But the mirror's influence was growing stronger. Over the next few days, the family began to experience vivid, terrifying hallucinations. Sarah would see shadowy figures lurking in the corners of her vision, while Mark found himself plagued by violent impulses he couldn't control. Emily and Jake began to hear whispers in their rooms at night, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the tension in the house reached a breaking point. Mark suddenly slammed his fist on the table, his face contorted with anger. "Why can't we just get rid of it?" he shouted. "Why are we still living like this?" Sarah tried to calm him, but he pushed her away, his eyes wild. "It's in my head, Sarah. I can't take it anymore." The children began to cry, and Sarah felt a surge of desperation. She knew they couldn't go on like this. They had to confront the mirror no matter the cost. That night, Sarah made a decision. She waited until everyone was asleep, then crept up to the attic alone. The mirror stood there, its surface glinting in the moonlight that filtered through the attic window. She approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. "I know you can hear me," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "I know what you are, and I'm not afraid of you." The mirror's surface rippled, and the voice returned, low and mocking. "You lie. You are afraid. You are weak." Sarah took a deep breath. "Maybe I am afraid, but I'm not weak, and I won't let you destroy my family." The mirror laughed, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You cannot stop me. Your fear feeds me. Your despair sustains me. You are mine." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver knife. It was an old family heirloom, one she had found in the attic weeks ago. She didn't know if it would work, but she had to try. "If you feed on fear," she said, her voice rising, "then I'll give you something else." With a cry, she slashed the blade across her palm, letting her blood drip onto the mirror's surface. The glass hissed and bubbled, the voice screaming in rage. The attic seemed to shake, the air growing thick with a suffocating darkness. Sarah felt a wave of dizziness, but she forced herself to stay upright. "You want fear?" she shouted. Together, the family climbed the stairs to the attic, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The mirror was almost fully reformed, its surface shimmering with an unnatural light. The voice returned, louder and more menacing than ever. "You cannot defeat me," it hissed. "I am eternal." Sarah stepped forward, her family close behind her. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "You're just a reflection of our fears, and we're not afraid anymore." She reached out and took Mark's hand, then Emily's and Jake's. Together, they formed a circle around the mirror, their bond stronger than the darkness that had plagued them. The mirror's surface began to crack again, the voice screaming in rage. But this time, the cracks spread faster, the glass shattering into countless pieces. The attic filled with a blinding light, and for a moment, the Thompsons felt as if they were being pulled into the mirror itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. The attic was silent, the mirror gone. All that remained was a faint, shimmering dust that slowly drifted to the floor. The Thompsons stood there, their hands still clasped together, their hearts racing. They had done it. They had faced their darkest fears and emerged victorious. But as they looked at each other, they knew that the experience had changed them. They would never forget the mirror or the lessons it had taught them about the power of fear and the strength of love. The aftermath. The days that followed the destruction of the mirror were quiet, almost unnervingly so. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted the house for weeks was gone, replaced by a sense of calm that the Thompsons hadn't realized they'd been missing. But the scars of their ordeal remained, both visible and invisible. Sarah's hand, though bandaged and healing, served as a constant reminder of what they had faced. The attic, now empty of the mirror, felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Yet no one ventured up there willingly. The memories were too fresh, too raw. On each other, the family fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. But there was a sense of unity, of resolve, that hadn't been there before. She didn't know why she kept it, but it felt important, like a reminder of what they had overcome. Years passed, and the Thompsons' lives continued to evolve. The mirror became a distant memory, a story they told only to each other, a shared secret that bound them together. They never forgot what they had faced, but they no longer let it define them. One day, as Sarah was cleaning out her desk, she found the silver shard, tucked away in a small box. She held it up to the light, watching it glint. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in its surface. A flicker of darkness, a whisper of fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She smiled, a small, sad smile, and placed the shard back in the box. "You're just a memory," she said softly, "and memories can't hurt us." She closed the box and put it away, then went to join her family in the living room. They were laughing, their voices warm and full of life. Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. They had faced their darkest fears and emerged stronger. And no matter what the future held, they would face it together.